Thank you, Charlotta. Our next segment will focus on what is happening in the world today with patients and clinicians. And joining us are two industry experts. Peter Durlach, Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer of Nuance, a Microsoft company, and Dr. Chris Mansi, the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Viz.si. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Zach. It's great to see you again, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and looking very much forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, me too. Great to be here talking about the impact of AI on our patients.
Let's jump right into our conversation with my first question. How is what your company is doing making a difference for medicine, for patients or doctors today? Can you give an example and a big picture? Let's go with Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Look, as doctors, we are so often in a race against time. Every year, millions of patients die or are disabled because by the time they get to the right doctor, it's just too late. At my company, Viz.si, we use artificial intelligence to increase access to care and speed up care. And I can give you a patient example from just last week. Last week, Sophie, she's a 31-year-old African-American woman. She started having weakness in her right arm and then lost her ability to speak completely. She was taken into hospital in a rural area where she received a CT scan of her head. Prior to Viz, that scan would enter a queue. It would be reviewed in time by the radiologist, and then, because it's a specialist case, by a neuroradiology specialist. Then an emergency physician would refer that patient to a specialist neurologist, then a neurosurgeon, until finally Sophie would be transferred to another specialist hospital for treatment. And you can imagine, this process takes time. On average, we know from studies that took between 3 and 5 hours. And because in this case, Sophie was having a stroke, every minute, 2 million of her brain cells were dying. Now, luckily for Sophie, the hospital that she was taken to had our technology, had Viz.si's neuro solution. And so her scan was immediately analyzed using artificial intelligence. And within a minute, everyone involved in stroke care across the entire health system, the neurosurgeon, the neurologist, the stroke nurse, the transport coordinator, were all alerted all at once, allowing the care team to coordinate and assemble, allowed the surgeons to prep, allowed the on-call specialist to make a decision and transfer that patient. And all of that happened not in 5 hours, but in less than 5 minutes. It meant that, Sophie was able to get the treatment she needed. We've seen in the cases of Sophie that we've been able to reduce time to treatment by over an hour, which equates to over 1 year less of disability on average, and a meaningful over 2.5-day reduction in length of stay. So Viz.si, we do this across numerous diseases, across neurology, cardiology, and oncology. We have 10 FDA clearances and are in over 1,400 hospitals in the United States, covering over 220 million lives. And our mission is to increase access to life-saving treatments like we did for Sophie last week. And our vision is to ensure that no patient suffers because of delays in diagnosis or delays in care. Luckily, Sophie was able to recover fully, and the next day she left the hospital and is now back to work.
Wonderful. I have a question, but I'd rather see if I can integrate it with a question to Peter. So Peter, I'm going to ask you the same question.
So we're a really good complement on this story. So I'm going to talk about, the life of the physician on sort of their own experience side of the world. And I'm going to use a physician that's a friend of mine in Michigan named Dave, who's a family practitioner. So Dave generally is like most physicians today. He is completely overwhelmed. He gets into the office in the morning. He's stacked up with patients. He has no time to basically really spend as much time on the patients as he's want. He's rushed between visits. He's spending probably half the time in his visit trying to keep in his mind what to document for clinical care. So this administrative burden builds up during the day. At 5 or 6, he goes home, and instead of spending time with his wife, seeing his kids play soccer, what is he doing? He's doing what we all know our physician friends do, is they do pajama time, which is they're trying to catch up on all of their documentation. And then the thing repeats itself the next way. It's like Groundhog Day. in a way for our clinicians. And this is not just for docs, it's for nurses too. So this process of administrative burden is just crushing. It's really the other endemic, that we've had besides COVID. So on the Nuance side, as many of you know Nuance more for its products and the company name in a way. So we have a product called Dragon Medical and PowerScribe, which are the key products for physicians and radiologists worldwide. And these products are meaningful in terms of reducing these burdens that patients have. And recently, in terms of using AI, we really launched about 3 years ago a breakthrough product called the Dragon Ambient Experience, which is a capability that allows clinicians and patients to basically reconnect and, with patient consent, record the conversation that they have, whether physical or virtual, and the AI produces the note automatically for the physician. And the benefit of that is really stunning in the sense that clinicians in that experience, normally when physicians see patients, they have two trains going on in their head. One is listening to the patient and trying to make decisions about what to do and how to care for that patient and what the assessment and plan would be. And the other train is trying to remember what they're going to have to document or put inside the medical record. And with our Dragon Ambient Experience product, or DAX, that second train is completely removed from the equation. We've had so many quotes from physicians. It's like, I forgot what it was like just to have a conversation with a patient. I did not go to medical school to spend twice as much time taking care of documentation as the patient. So it's really been a breakthrough technology for us. It's not perfect like most AI. It can make mistakes like any technology can, but it's really been quite powerful. And from an outcomes point of view, as Chris mentioned, on the patient side, we're seeing things of 50% reduction in documentation time, savings of 7 minutes per encounter, 80% improvement in reduction of burnout and fatigue, 40% improvement in first-time prior auth approvals, because the notes are so much better than the physician would have done on their own because they don't have time. And very powerfully, because the physician is looking the patient in the eye and not being as distracted, the patients are feeling it too. So just like you and I, when we talk to someone, if someone looks us in the eye and we feel they're listening, the experience feels much better. So we have a system connected with our Dragon Ambient Experience product where physicians are actually do QR codes with their patients when they leave the room. And we see about an 80% improvement in patients' experience of, was the physician paying attention? Did they listen to what my problem was? And did they take the time to explain what needed to be done? And one of the best quotes I think we've had, I want to give you two just real quickly, from my friend and then a colleague of his, is we need to spend more time holding the hand of the patient and less time holding the hand of the mouse. The other big thing I wanted to mention from a point of view, we know that we have roughly 50% of all physicians in the US and worldwide are burned out, and we're going to have a significant shortage of physicians. I think the latest estimate is almost 100,000 here in the US alone. So this idea of how do you keep clinicians in the practice of medicine and also working if you're an institution for you. One of the great quotes, I just want to give it so I didn't quote it. This is from another friend of mine in the Midwest who manages the physician group. And he said, I had one physician that was involved in our use of DAX. She sent a note to my CEO, said, if you take DAX away, I'll literally quit. It's that simple. And again, it's the point that AI, although it's not perfect, as Chris has mentioned and I mentioned, can make a dramatic impact both on the clinician experience and on the patient experience.
So those are very helpful stories to contextualize why you're doing what you're doing. Let me ask more of an implementation detail. Chris, we're not used to getting these fast readouts of these imaging technologies. And in the case of your patient, we were lucky, she was lucky, the hospital's lucky that they're organized to respond rapidly to this. And so the question I have for both of you is two-part question. So part one is, what are you looking for in these hospitals that tell you that they're ready and willing to do this? And second is, to what degree do you have to integrate with existing IT infrastructure, such as electronic health record systems? So let's start with Chris.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We have built up a large services organization that works with hospitals on change management because, we see a big variation in readiness to implement, the cutting edge systems of care, right? So whether it's a thrombectomy and stroke, whether it's aneurysm follow-up, whether it's, monitoring patients for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, right? There's a challenge in healthcare where these patients are often living in a generalist medical environment, but they need to be treated by the specialist. So we'll take best practices from centers that specialize in these conditions, codify them, integrate them with our software, and help health systems, not just hospitals, but health systems implement the technology with all of the human elements of healthcare around it. So that might be arranging one-stop clinics for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy management, where you review the AI-enhanced EKG, but also you have an echo technician there and you decide immediately what the follow-up treatment might be, right? Our mission, as I said before, is to increase access to life-saving treatments. So what we look for when we're looking to partner is a real willingness to focus on this particular treatment. So we look for diseases where they're going to kill you or disable you if they're not treated appropriately, where our life science partners in device or pharma have developed a therapy that works, right, and is cleared and is proven to work on those patients, and where there's an access problem. Typically we're looking for diseases where over 80% of patients with the disease are not actually getting the optimal standard of care as defined by either the guidelines or by the major specialist societies. And then we'll go into hospital systems and work with them to implement that new workflow enhanced by the AI trigger, because it is different, right? Instead of having to wait 2 years for the patient to move, around the system, within minutes, they're getting put into a list or immediately getting alerted to the specialist phone for diagnosis and decision-making. Your question on IT implementation is also a very important one because there's lots of IT systems in the hospitals you have to integrate with. And we integrate with, the necessary ones like PACS, DICOM, EHR. But, doctors typically are using Viz.ai in parallel to the EHR. If you think of the electronic health record as a system of record, Viz.ai is really the system of action. So we're using artificial intelligence to read data, make that data meaningful and actionable, so that patients can get diagnosed and treated in a timely manner. And a good statistic showing the way we've been able to do that is we see that over 92% of our AI-triggered alerts are viewed by the relevant specialist, whether it's a cardiologist, oncologist, or neurologist, within 5 minutes. So they're paying attention. It's really an acute kind of real-time system that they're using to make decisions about care, rather than to store notes and to kind of store the exponentially increasing amount of healthcare data we have.
So when you say they, who do you have to get on board for a successful implementation? Is it the CIO, the head, the chair of radiology? Who? I mean, I'm sure it's different in different hospitals, but typically, who do you have to convince?
Yeah, and it's even broader than that, because often you're working, at least for us, we're working on a specific disease state. And so we may well have partners outside of the health system, whether it's a payer or a device manufacturer or pharmaceutical who's helping to kind of build up these programs. Within the hospital, number one, the clinicians, right? So the specialist clinicians who are treating these patients. If it's a radiology-triggered disease, like from a scan, then the chair of radiology. If it's an EKG, it's the chair of cardiology. And then the service line administrator. So it's often done on a service line by service line basis. However, we're seeing a interesting trend now, because we're across multiple service lines. The vast majority of the time, we're having enterprise level conversations with the CIO, because the CIOs don't want 95 AI vendors coming in that they have to handle. They want one platform. And Viz really is the leader in that. And so we'll often integrate not just our own algorithms that we've developed, but third-party algorithms that a health system wants to use but someone else has developed, whether that's another company or their own clinicians. And I predict in 3 to 5 years' time, we'll have 100 algorithms on Viz.ai, of which maybe 30 of them, 20 to 30 of them will be our own, 70 to 80 of them will be other people's algorithms.
So, Peter, I want to give you a chance to answer the same question, but I do think it's an important a discussion point, which is there are literally hundreds of vendors of different AI solutions. And what do you see as how this is going to sort out? Because I do think that no CIO or department chair is going to know what to do and will throw up their arms if they have to deal with 50 vendors. So, Peter.
Yeah, let me try
to
answer the original questions a little quickly and then get to that. So yeah, it's a great question, as Chris mentioned. So on our using again our Dragon ambient experience solution, it sits on top of the Dragon platform, which in the US, 70% of all physicians already use every day. So they're very used to the platform and the workflow capability. So you do have to get buy-in and deploy it, but we have the luxury of already being deployed at these hospitals and these physician practices today. So generally the CMIO and others are helping to sort of do this as part of a natural upgrade. So it's not quite as big a lift as Chris mentioned, is kind of a new platform. We do have other products that are more like in Chris's case, sort of newer to the place. I would agree with him. You have to find a champion. We have best practices, and it does vary across hospitals and systems about how ready they are, for this. And we sort of have a playbook that we follow with all of our products. In terms of the integration, I'll answer it in two ways. With the traditional Nuance products, where the EHR partners and PACS vendors have been 20-year partners for us. So on the EHR, whether it's Epic, Cerner, Meditech, Athena, et cetera, we have deep integrations with them over many, many years. And our products, a little bit different than Chris in this example, the core products like Dragon Medical and Dragon Medical Lab Experience work inside the workflow of the native EHR. So the integration is super critical for adoption by the clinicians, and we are sort of the preferred partner of almost all of the EHRs to do that. So it's an important part, and we help make their systems better and used by their clinicians. So it's a very tight partnership on that. In terms of the number of algorithm vendors, in the imaging space, we actually have a platform similar to Chris, except we don't operate in the FDA regulated environment in terms of what we build with Microsoft. We actually have a platform that we only host third-party algorithms. I agree with Chris that on the imaging-centric world, no CIO wants 65 infrastructures, each with 2 or 3 algorithms. It's just not consumable. It's impossible to do. So there's a real consolidation happening on the imaging side. I think in the mainstream clinical workflow, you're going to see the same thing. And as you know, a number of the EHR partners are also building infrastructures to run these platforms in there. So I think you have to decide at which layer. Like on the Microsoft side, we have a platform in the cloud for running the EHR and supporting these models. And then there's the systems that are the systems of record, systems of action, whatever you want to call them, at the clinical place. So I think you're going to have platform winners at different parts of the stack. Obviously, us on the Microsoft side are competing on the core cloud infrastructure side. On top of that, you could have other players that sit on top of that can win. The other thing I will mention about the integration piece, just to represent both Nuance and Microsoft on this conversation. On the Microsoft side, as you know, we're also opening up both all of the Azure capabilities for building and deploying models and accessing these new large language models that are coming through a native Azure interface. So there are also a whole set of integrations that people can do just through an API endpoint at the cloud layer, in addition to connecting the Nuance branded products into the clinical workflow. So you're going to see a bunch of different critical connection points of this AI technology, depending on what part of the stack you're talking about and what application the customer is most interested in.
Well, you both brought up very good points. I think it's still going to be murky for most decision makers how these different platforms are going to work together. Probably, I think you're right. I mean, one winner for each stack. But those are discussions and shifts that are only beginning to happen now, but they're going to accelerate. We're running out of time, and so rather than talk about this very interesting point, I have 2 questions left, one for each of you. I'll start with you, Peter, and then we'll go to Chris. the one for you, Peter, is you're also part of Microsoft, and Microsoft just rolled out Bing AI, and which is essentially ChatGPT within the search function, and patients are interacting directly now with this AI functionality. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so it's a great question. As you know, Zach, from being in the middle of this, it's a complicated one. So on one hand, the new technology is quite powerful, and it's quite a breakthrough in terms of the capabilities it can do. On the other hand, at Microsoft and Nuance, we have a real responsibility, and we believe in this idea of responsible and ethical in AI, and how do we do this in a safe and compliant way? And yet we also enable the ecosystem to use this technology, so we don't control how everything is going to be used. I would say on the patient side, you and I have talked about this before. My personal view on this, I'm speaking as Pete Durlak here, is that I would love physicians to have access to this capability, and I would love patients to also have access, understanding that this technology is not always going to be right, and is often or is not always going to be 100% accurate. But in many cases, because many patients don't have access to good clinical care all the time, and they have lots of questions, and we know how busy clinicians are, don't we want our patients to be informed with more information about what their symptoms might represent? Doesn't mean that you shouldn't go to a doctor. You absolutely should, and you shouldn't make any decision, I would argue, almost based on anything on the web around your health. You should take that data input and help make a decision with your clinical partners. So I think it is generally a beneficial piece, but we have to be careful and make sure people understand that the technology is still at a very early stage, and that it's going to have to evolve in a way that's safe and reliable. And I think that's going to be a journey that we're all going to have to go on together. And it's going to be a community effort to make sure that we do that the right way, including, governmental agencies and others. So I think it's got a huge upside. And I also think there are areas that we have to be concerned about, that we have to, do more work on together as a community.
It is an exciting time, and I think it's high time for us to have at a different venue, a large discussion about this. Speaking about controversy and discussion, Chris, there's a lot of concern that there's many opportunities for systematic bias that these algorithms might bring, depending on how these algorithms are implemented, the data that it's pulled from and trained on. You've had to deal with this. What are your thoughts about how do we manage these issues around bias in machine learning and AI?
It's a very important question, Zach. And actually, I'll answer in two parts, because I think the most important part of this is bias in healthcare. How do you reduce bias in healthcare overall? And then how do you minimize bias when developing algorithms? The first one's actually the bigger problem today, the bias in the human systems that we've set up. Today, your race or socioeconomic status heavily impacts the care you get. Black patients in America, on average, have less access to care and poorer outcomes than white patients. Right? What technology can do, it could actually potentially be a very important part of the solution of systematic bias in healthcare. For example, when our algorithms look at an EKG, a heart tracing, it doesn't know, when it's looking at the heart tracing, the color of the patient's skin. Additionally, it doesn't get tired at 2 a.m. or understaffed on a weekend. Like, as a neurosurgeon, I can tell you I often did. In our FDA study, we actually saw this reduction in variation or bias playing out. We saw a huge reduction in standard deviation, a 96% reduction in standard deviation, which is a statistical measure of variation of time from presentation to referral, from 120 minutes down to 7 minutes of variation. And so you can see that the technology, because it works the same every time, it's consistent, no matter what time of day, or it's blind to things like color, can actually reduce bias and variation in care. However, you have to be very, very careful and intentional with how you train an algorithm. Because if you only trained an algorithm on patients in the Bay Area, for example, where I live, you might introduce bias so that it performs worse on patients in Georgia or Tennessee than it does on patients in San Francisco. And so what that has meant is that we've built up techniques to ensure a very, very diverse training data set. And then I've worked very closely with the FDA. We were the first ones to get FDA clearance via the de novo route from the FDA. So we've worked with them from the very beginning to ensure that the test set that they're testing your algorithm on actually reflects the population, whether it's based on sex, race, socioeconomic status, of the population that it's going to be applied to, which is the broader US population. And I think I have to say the FDA have been very innovative and conscious about how they think about this. And when you submit your algorithm, your performance test to the FDA, you have to demonstrate that it performed just as well on different patients, depending on things like sex, race, and socioeconomic status.
Wow, I would like to continue discussing about that, not least of which, how did you get the right diverse populations? But unfortunately, our time has come to close, and I want to thank each of you for a really informative discussion. I'm sorry it had to be so short.
Thank you very much, Zach, and thank you, NEJM AI, for having me here today.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Appreciate the offer to be a great conversation. Chris, great to be on here with you. So thanks to everybody.
Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Thomas Lee, Editor-in-Chief of New England Journal of Medicine Catalyst, Innovations in Care Delivery, for our next segment.